This is Stuck. I'm your host, Andrew Wiles. It was an ordinary Wednesday back in 1983 that an immaculate schoolgirl by the name of Diane Smith was abducted and violently killed and dumped like garbage in a gully. And police zoomed in on a man by the name of Jenkins. He was called Shorty because he's Jamaican. He was short. And there was no doubt that Shorty was going to be found guilty of this very, very serious offense. If you want to get a sense of the mood at the time, his lawyers had to eventually file an application with the court, go to the court and say, change the venue. The crowd leading to the court was so boisterous. The people were so angry. At one point, they grabbed his mother. Political leaders, right up to the prime minister, had come out and talked about the crime. And there was no doubt that the weight of the state and the voice of the people, the conscience of the people were against this man. A young lawyer knew Jenkins and decided to represent him. And this young lawyer got his seniors to come along and join the defense. At the trial, the government's forensic expert gave evidence that seemed to link this man directly to the crime. Despite all of that, the sentiment of the government, the public's outrage, the presence of forensic evidence, the prosecution could not convince. Shorty would end up having 2 trials. In the first trial, 11 of the 12 jurors said guilty. 1 said not guilty. For the second trial, everything changed, and every single juror said not guilty. Despite the political sentiment, despite the outrage of the public, despite even the same forensic evidence on the part of the prosecution. The young lawyer who was there in that case in 1983 is our guest today on Stuck, Bert Samuels. If you're just joining us on this journey, we're talking about wrongful convictions in Jamaica, and we're trying to answer 3 questions: how they happen, who they impact, and what we as ordinary Jamaicans can do about them. When it comes to the question of how they happen, there are few people as qualified to talk about that than Bert Samuels. When I started to think about wrongful convictions in Jamaica, I didn't know what kind of information I would find, but I knew that I would find evidence pointing to the things that cause wrongful convictions because, well, in my short time practicing criminal law in Jamaica, I had seen everything that the researchers who write about wrongful convictions in the US and Canada and the UK, everything that they write about, I had witnessed firsthand in my practice. I asked myself, what would I find if I spoke to somebody who had been practicing for a little longer? Well, Bert Samuels has practiced criminal law in Jamaica. In fact, he has been at the center of criminal and constitutional law in Jamaica for more than 46 years. Since before he took it on himself to represent Jenkins back in 1983 to his 46th year when he was a part of the historic Privy Council win in the Vibes Kartel matter and eventually their acquittal at the Court of Appeal in Jamaica. Bert Samuels has made it his life's mission to stand for the constitutional rights of the citizen. He believes in the presumption of innocence and a fair trial. In fact, today he and I talk about a paper he wrote back in 1996 about the presumption of innocence and a fair trial when he was at year 17. If there is anything to take away from today's discussion, it's this. We are talking about wrongful convictions in Jamaica. And in one way, it's like a brand new topic. We haven't had any inquiries into wrongful convictions. We don't have the things that you point to show a country conscious of the reality of wrongful convictions. But if you look back, if you look closely, you will see that there have been people who have raised the concern in Jamaica for decades. that should be both encouraging and a bit disheartening. It's encouraging because it shows that the foundation is there, that the bones are there. We are not starting this thing from scratch. But it is frustrating because here is an era in which we could perhaps have been pioneers, where other Caribbean countries, developed countries, could have come to us to say, how are you guys solving this issue? And instead, we find ourselves behind. And not just behind the US and Canada and the UK, but we are behind our own standards. The foundations that we have set, the things that we have said are not okay, we have not fixed. And that is what makes the issue of wrongful convictions today so pressing, why we have to talk about it and deal with it now. So without anything more, I invite you to listen to this conversation. The paper that we discuss is available. You can get it at my website, andrewwiles.com/stuck. This is my conversation with Bert Samuels. One cause of wrongful convictions that they talk about is imagined crimes. And one of the things that come up with that is police misconduct and manufacturing of evidence. And you have spoken about this, talked about this. You had a case, David Clark, where you wrote about this. Basically, you were saying that if there's no case, don't manufacture one. Could you speak about that type of activity and how it contributes to wrongful convictions in Jamaica?
Of what, in my own experience, what contribution police misconduct has made to the wrongful convictions. So the most glaring case is one of the biggest murder cases in Jamaica was the Queen against Dennis Jenkins, who was eventually acquitted. And when there's an acquittal, you don't have a record of what happened, right? So you have to talk to the lawyers. He was tried twice, retrial first. One juror of 12 said not guilty, 11 said guilty. And then we did a second trial. This is 1983, Queen against Dennis Jenkins. So
Could you tell us some more about it?
Pardon?
Could you tell us some more about the facts of that case?
I'm going to tell you the facts now. So here we go. So Dennis Jenkins happened to have been the brother of our housekeeper at my house. He was not able to pay fees, so we decided to have it pro bono and represented him. I was a young lawyer at the time, just 2 years at the bar, and I had senior counsel KD Knight doing the first trial. In the first trial, the government forensic scientist gave evidence that she examined hairs on the crime scene, which were compared with the hair taken from the suspect, which he did not consent to. She put them under the comparison microscope. On one side was the hair that was known, his hair. Secondly, hair found on the crime scene. And she said that they were similar. And she gave that evidence at the trial, which was hugely compelling. And for some reason, we were lucky that one person didn't like the matter, and we got a retrial. So here comes the retrial. As I said, he was a poor prisoner, but Mr. Spaulding, who was the Minister of Justice at the time, decided to use the Poor Prisoners Act, and we approached him if he would allow a defense forensic scientist to come for trial number 2. So we got a forensic scientist out of Florida. He was more often in the Cayman Islands. He testified in many trials for the prosecution in the Cayman Islands. When he examined the exhibits were brought to him by the Jamaican scientist who flew up to Florida to his laboratory with the exhibits, because he was going to do looking at the exhibits before the trial. He wanted to write his opinion before the trial. In his laboratory, he found something very strange. He said that he has never seen a case in which so many of the unknown hairs, those are the hairs on the scene, the crime scene, the population of unknown hairs was about 7-8 times more than he has ever seen in his experience. So that was a red flag for him. He then asked the scientist, I've never seen so much hair deposited by a assailant on a crime scene. She said to him, well, there's a culture in Jamaica, and this is going to make you laugh, where men travel with their flyers down. He knew that that was a lie. It was an attempt to explain misconduct. So he made the examination, and he had the known hairs, he had the unknown hairs, and for some reason, he decided to testify. So he came to Jamaica to testify for the defense. What happened that we discovered that the hairs that were said to to be found on the crime scene were planted by the police on the crime scene, having cut the hair of our client. And he was able to prove that that happened. And so it was one of my first alarming exposure to police misconduct. They actually took his hair and deposited it on the crime scene. Now, you and I know that when you're going to take exhibits concerning a crime, the accused should be present during the collection of the exhibits to make sure that what is collected is what is sealed in the exhibit envelope. All of that was not done in that case. So if you ask me, what did we learn from that case? Lesson number one was that the police who take samples from our clients, be it for liquid, saliva, blood, the integrity of the investigation, integrity of those exhibits is very important, because you can take substance from my mouth, my saliva, and then say that you found that saliva on the crime scene. So, it's very difficult to control that, because the police will give excuses to the court why the accused was not brought to witness the collection and the sealing in on exhibit envelope of the exhibits. So, in summary, it was my first exposure to the fact that the collection of exhibits on a crime scene should have the accused and his attorney present during the collection of exhibits, because that's where the misconduct comes about, because the police is anxious to solve the crime. And that was my experience in that Dennis Jenkins case. The second, when we exposed it in the second trial, there was a unanimous 12-member jury saying not guilty, because we were able to expose both the scientists and the collectors, the police, were colluding to get a conviction.
Wow. And this is really interesting, because I hope you're hearing me, in Canada, there are a number of cases where the people were convicted because of expert evidence. They felt like they couldn't refute it, and the expert evidence was from an expert who was then proven to be biased and false. And then you have the same thing in the US, where for years an expert was just making up lab results.
Yes.
And I mean,
and you and I, when we are naive, and jurors have a lot of respect for experts, They give their CV from the witness box. They say what their experience is, how many times they have testified, the colleges they have gone to. And also an extension of that is DNA laboratories, which themselves are not following the protocols. DNA laboratories is a big source, because DNA evidence is so compelling that we have to be careful. Who is it that is coming to court to testify? So the laboratories, they're working for the police. So for example, in Jamaica, the forensic laboratory is a police forensic laboratory. It's not independent. The defense doesn't have access to these laboratories. It is a police institution.
Can I read you something that Bert Samuels wrote in 1996?
Okay.
It is convenient to raise here the difficulties the defense faces where it seeks to have analyzed scientific evidence it may need to establish the innocence of the accused. The forensic laboratory operates and functions as an extension of the prosecutor's office. This should not be so. That laboratory is funded by taxpayers. It is as much a facility to be used by the prosecution as it is to be enjoyed by the defendant.
Yeah. So that you can't be telling me that is still...
Yes.
What exists.
That's what we did.
If you look at the document, pay attention to the sentence he writes next, which is really relevant when you think about the case of Lacine Edwards.
All right, can I move on now to the hiding of evidence?
Yes.
The concealment of evidence. And the first case that comes to mind is Sangster Dixon, which went all the way up to the Privy Council. And this is what happened. So there's a Western Union establishment which was robbed by armed men. And in the Western Union was a police officer. And during the robbery, he was shot and killed. Now in Jamaica, if you kill a police officer on duty, it's capital punishment. So the sentence for the men was, one got about 30 years, the other was sentenced to death. One of either Sangster or Dixon, one or the other. The matter went to the Court of Appeal, and the men lost their appeal, so their conviction for 30 years imprisonment and execution, death penalty, was affirmed. It then went to the Privy Council. And the Privy Council looked at the statement given by the police investigating officer soon after the shooting by the manager of the Western Union. And she said words to the effect, "Officer, don't worry, it's all on tape." All right. So the Privy Council asks, with that information from the manager of the Western Union, why didn't any of the videotape feature in the trial? And the court's initiative, they asked for the videotape. The police at all times had the videotape. The prosecution in Jamaica had the statement that the videotape is available. Now, you and I know that the classic statement by the prosecution is that they should not be anxious to get a conviction. They must put the evidence before the court. Well, that evidence was suppressed and concealed. It didn't feature in the trial. It didn't feature in the Court of Appeal in Jamaica. It was the Privy Council who had it played in the Privy Council, and it showed that the men who were on the robbery had no appearance, no similarity to Sangster and Dixon. Now, listen to this. Sangster and Dixon went on an ID parade, and there are police officers who were in the Western Union who survived. They went on the parade and pointed them out. So they have the best evidence is not being used. That's the videotape. They use the recollection of a witness. Now, you and I know, maybe you don't, that once something like that happens, the police goes and arrests so-called bad men in the community. And they go by hearsay and people telling them stuff. So no doubt, Sangster and Dixon were brought in, not because they were there, but because they're supposed to be men who are likely to do that. So when the judgment of the Court of Appeal is written in Sangster and Dixon, you will see them saying, the court had a right to accept the witness who pointed them out on the parade because police officers are trained the special powers of observation and that. And I'm laughing because when I saw the Privy Council decision that the ID parade was either corrupt or it was they made mistakes, I'm saying let me look what the Court of Appeal said about the police evidence on the identification parade. And it was so nicely written. But that is a lesson that the suppression of evidence almost led to the execution of a Jamaican citizen because they hid available and the best evidence was not given to the jury in the jury trial. So suppression of evidence is a huge thing in policing in Jamaica. Once it will exonerate the suspect, it is likely not to come before the court.
In any of these cases that you've mentioned, has there ever been anybody who's held accountable? It seems like the court gives a lot of deference to the police.
Very good point. If you talk about accountability, you're talking now about another area called prosecutorial misconduct. And the tort that comes to mind is tort. It's in a public office. Give me that. It's a tort. Misfeasance in a public office.
Right.
All right. Misfeasance in a public office is that if a public servant does something that is known to them to be incorrect and they're doing it out of spite for someone, you can get a remedy called misfeasance in a public office. A lot of these decisions, even the Sangster and Dixon case, there ought to have been an inquiry to find out why is it that the prosecutor, who had a statement from the investigating officer that the manager of the Western Union told him that there is video evidence, why they didn't use it, why they suppressed it, why they didn't want to use it. And the answer to that is what we have around us is career prosecutors. Career prosecutors who are they're opposed to being ministers of justice. They get a case, they want to win the case at any cost. And therefore, they will also collude with the police to suppress evidence. And there are cases where DNA evidence has excluded a suspect. And in the face of the DNA evidence, you have IC evidence. So they use the results of the identification parade and putting aside the scientific evidence. And I have a case called Hamilton. Can I tell you about the Hamilton case?
Yes, please.
The Hamilton case is this. A young lady and her boyfriend, who was a police officer, were at home. A gentleman broke into the home and had sex with the policeman's girlfriend, but he used a condom. The rapist used a condom. When he was leaving, at gunpoint he raped. He took off the condom, threw it away, and jumped over a wall and escaped. Her police boyfriend was able to retrieve the condom, which had semen in it, and he gave it to an investigator. They held an identification parade for a suspect, and that suspect was pointed out on the ID parade. When the suspect was in custody, I did the trial. He said, Mr. Samuels, I know nothing of this. I'm prepared to give voluntarily my body fluids, saliva, blood, anything they want. I'm prepared to give it to the police. I had him sign that he's consenting to that, and we gave this to the police. When the results came, when they matched the sperm with his body fluids, he was excluded.
Right.
When that happened, my client is still before the courts for rape. I wrote to the DPP's office and said, listen, the DNA evidence excludes our client, although he was positively pointed out on an ID parade by the victim. Do you believe that the DPP did not stop the case? It went to trial. The forensic expert came to court, said she matched our client's body fluids with the sperm, and he was excluded. And the case ended at the no case submission stage. So what you find happening is, and that's not the singular case, there's a case in Montego Bay. So what you find happening is there is a tendency and a culture at the DPP's office which is called put it up and see what happens. That means you proceed with the case in the face of exclusory evidence by DNA. And that is what now, you put the accused through the expense of a trial, you put the accused through the trauma of a trial, when it is very well known that the case has nowhere going. But your original question is accountability.
Right.
Well, no one has ever been, recently I'm proud to say that my chambers, we caused one of our clients at the end of prosecutorial misconduct. He reported the prosecutor to the general legal counsel. She was tried and found guilty of misconduct where she was creating evidence. And it's a matter of record. It's a matter of the JLC against Sophia Thomas. She's a member of the DPP's office. And the reason why I spoke about this, because she has exhausted her appeals. She appealed to the Jamaican Court of Appeal. And about 2 months ago, her conviction for prosecutorial misconduct was upheld by the Court of Appeal of Jamaica. And that is a case in which she was manufacturing evidence. If you want me to tell you the facts, I can, but I don't know if you have time for that.
I have time, but what I want to know is why did you think it was so important to go that extra step? And some Jamaica is a country where people say, boy, don't stop nobody food. And that's the way we think about even professional responsibility.
Yes, you're right. All right, so this is what. So on trial was a former bank manager, and he's tertiarily educated. The decision to report her was primarily his. We supported it, but he says, this wrong, it must be wrong. Now, this is my view, and maybe your listeners should know this, that 90% of judges are former prosecutors. So that the DPP's department in Jamaica is the alma mater of judges who move from the DPP to become judges. And one of my deep fears, was this particular prosecutor, who was very ambitious, would in soon time, become a judge. And this is what happened. We were in court. She was leading evidence. She tried to hand up a document to show to the witness, and I asked to see the document before it was placed in the hands of her witness. She showed it to me, and I complained to the judge. She has no right to be giving the witness a copy. The rule is that the witness must get the original. It was his statement. Where's the original? Why are you showing him that copy? She said, I thought it was the copy, and then she started to search, couldn't find the original, and promised that if she gets an adjournment, she would find the original. She left, and we were adjourned for 2 weeks. Now, based on my experience, a red flag came in my mind. Maybe she couldn't find it in first place, and maybe she will never find it. So she came back 2 weeks later, came before the court. Judge, I found it. I have the original. May I see it, Miss Thomas? She handed it to me. She didn't remember or know that we had a photocopy of the original. And when we compared, in my left hand was the copy of the original, and my right hand was her original that she said she found. There were 11 differences. Some of them were commas, some of them were spaces, some of them were full stops. There were 11 differences between what she said was the original and what the copy of the original, photocopy of the original that we had. We complained to the judge, and eventually the DPP herself came to the trial, intervened, and offered no further evidence. And our client said, no, this misconduct cannot go unpunished. He made a report to the General Legal Counsel. We prosecuted the matter in the General Legal Counsel on his behalf, where he gave evidence. And the rest is history. She has been suspended from practice for 6 months, and the Court of Appeal dismissed her appeal. So for the first time in the history of Jamaica, a prosecutor has been made to face her wrongs and has been punished by the General Legal Counsel for breach of the canons.
What stood out to me reading that case was the diligence in checking the differences between the statements. And I mean, it's kind of pivoting. I want us to come back to this. But one thing that also features in wrongful convictions is the work of defense counsel.
Yes.
Many people would not have gone through a statement to check to see full stops, commas, to be able to show that the documents are different.
Yeah. It's a sixth sense. It's years of experience. It's observing prosecutors and listening to them. And it's not the first time that I've caught them with their hands in the cookie jar. I have found other instances. Can I tell you another instance?
Sure. You have time. I have time.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm going to be very harsh now. A case prior to that was in court, and I went to court like 45 minutes before court starts. And I say this to lawyers, defense lawyers, go to court early. Don't reach at 10. You need to be walking around, look if anyone is interfering with the jurors. Be vigilant. When I looked in a closed courtroom through the glass, I saw the prosecutor and one of her witnesses. The matter was part heard, and the body language showed that they were disagreeing one with the other. She was disagreeing with a sergeant of police, a female sergeant of police. But I couldn't hear. I'm not allowed to listen to them. But I observed it. So it's observation and experience. So when the witness was through being questioned by her, I stood up to question her witness. And it went this way. You were at court early this morning and your evidence was being discussed by someone with you? Yes, sir. And there was a disagreement between yourself and the person who was talking to you about your evidence? Yes, sir. Now, that disagreement had to do with the kind of evidence you were to give? Yes, sir. Was that person trying to tell you to change that evidence? Yes, sir. In your own experience, officer, is that wrong? She says, yes. And I said, well, further, is it any offense created by that? She says, yes. I said, what? It's perverting the course of justice. The person was telling you to change what you had written and replace it with something else. Yes, sir. And then I said, in open court, is the person in the courtroom now? And she said yes. And I stopped there. And I bowed over and made a little mutter I said to the prosecutor, I'm going to give you a chance this time. And then I sat down. So, yes, so that's what happens. Sometimes a career prosecutor will coach a witness to fit into the testimony of the case that she wants the jury to hear, not necessarily the truth. And that police officer stood her ground. She stood her ground. And not many officers were that strong. And I really appreciate the fact that she could not be, forced to change her testimony from what she had written for what the prosecutor wanted her to say. And that could have led to a conviction.
Yeah, back in the point you're raising, you're talking about in terms of the transition of the prosecutors to the bench, is something you spoke about again in 1996. You said back then that you had done your own research. Of 16 High Court judges, only 3 from my research have ever defended. And 2 of these 3 have done so for less than 2 years. And you gave a little diagram, right?
Yeah. Where you got that paper from? It's online?
It's online. It's at the Bar Association. They have a archive of old presentations. It's very good.
There were no CLE courses then, back then, CLE courses. They just asked me to make the presentation.
No, but...
As a young lawyer then, a little
really?
boy.
96.
I was 17 years. I was 17 years at the bar at that time. And now I'm 46 years at the bar.
One thing you spoke about back in 1996 was how our prisoners are kept. Our people who are arrested and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. The conditions in which they are kept are such. It's so hard and so harsh that many people have been induced just by the conditions and the denial of bail to even enter guilty pleas. Let me read back. It says,
Yeah.
though no statistics are available, it is the experience of many criminal lawyers that persons have been induced to end the ordeal of their incarceration by giving a guilty plea. Many confessions have also been given where the defendant was led to believe that he would be let out of his filthy cell if he cooperated. At times, these guilty pleas and confessions are given by innocent persons whose mental fabric caused them to bow under the harsh conditions. He had started that by describing just how harsh the conditions are that people are kept in, though they are innocent until proven guilty.
So the starting point is 1996. At that time, we were still 15 years away from the new Charter of Rights. And the reason why I'm thinking of the new Charter of Rights vis-a-vis conditions in custody is because the Charter itself has now said that the state has a responsibility to keep people in custody in humane conditions. And so you have a constitutional right for your incarceration to be humane. That is not being followed. The jails are the same as they were in 1996. But at least for relief, constitutional relief, a person can go and say, listen, the conditions were so harsh. But back to that point I was making, that people who have been kept in a cell where the ventilation is extremely poor, sanitary conditions are poor, there are no toilets, there are no beds. Once you put a person who has never been used to that situation in that condition, if you go to take a confession from them, they're likely to cooperate with the person who is forcing them to confess to a crime because they just want to get out. And very often they don't realize that they're sinking themselves deeper because they are concentrated on their immediate needs to come out. So a police officer will say, just tell me how it went and I will release you. That's the famous one to get the conviction. So you're there saying, you don't need a lawyer, just tell me what happened. So you foolishly tell them what happened because he tells you that he's going to open the doors of the cell and you can go home. So when I arrive on the scene, the confession is already made before a justice of the peace. I said, why did you tell all of this? Is it true? No, it's not. But he promised me that he would release me. And Mr. Samuels, the jails, it's harsh inside there. And if you want to know how harsh it was, then and still is, if you go to the case of the death of Agana Barrett in the Constant Spring lockup, you will see a man, a tiler, he was a tiler, going to work, scraped up with several other young men, and detained without any information that they had committed any offense. Just detention. Now, back then, and still happens, the police walks into a community and just take up young men under the guise that they're going to process them, not because anyone has made a complaint against them. So Agana Barrett and several other men were put into the cells at Constant Spring. The ventilation was so poor, the cell was overpopulated with individuals that they began to, as it were, they didn't have enough oxygen. They became delirious and then they began to drink their own urine. They were thirsty until death. 2 of them died in the cell. So the Agana Barrett case is a full and clear description of the typical Jamaican cell, that you can actually die inside the cell just from the conditions. And then there are other issues in the Jamaican jails. It's overcrowded. So if you are a weak person physically or mentally, then you are bullied in the cell. And therefore, everything that requires you to lose control, to want to come out, there's a recipe there. So if you look at the case of the gentleman in Montego Bay who is on trial now, that death, his name is, help me, it's in
Mario
Westmoreland.
Dean.
The case, in what?
Mario Dean
case. He went in for a ganja spliff and he was put in a cell for punishment because he could have gotten bail. So yes, so my view is that a lot of the confessions which came about in 1996 were induced by bad jail conditions, and people were tricked into thinking if I just sign what the police wrote, I'll be released. Now, if a case starts on that, then the wrongful conviction that will emanate from the confession which is forced, the person has been forced to, is bad. Because very often what the prosecution or the judge is looking at, does he have any physical injuries to suggest that he was forced? So these are a set of confessions where there are no physical injuries, but the conditions themselves cause the person to commit themselves to sign a confession where that is. Now there's another issue with the confession. Today, you have the right to an attorney to give you instructions if there's a confession to be made. And I'll tell you this, the majority of murder cases before duty counsel, that is your right to be the state pays for that counsel, has reduced by about 90%. All of a sudden, prisoners are no longer confessing because attorneys can protect them against any of these things. So it is a real thing. So if you're looking at convictions prior to duty counsel era, I call it the duty counsel era, you'll find that most of those murder cases had confessions in them. Most of them, the confessions were not in the presence of attorneys. It was in the presence of a justice of the peace who was picked by the police. And sometimes the beatings take place before the justice of the peace arrives. He just arrives for the signatures. All right. I don't want to stray too much in explaining stuff. Go ahead.
No, but it's interesting because that's something else that you spoke about here, about the introduction of PACE, the Police Act in England, and how when it came in, it helped to cut down on these false confessions. I know that even though we aren't practicing the tape recording, sometimes when interviewing suspects, and I'm wondering, is it that it has come far enough, like having a duty counsel there, is that enough, or are all the interactions between the police and the suspect, do we need to have protections there to have those other interactions tape recorded?
But are you saying that with the protections that are in place now, is the problem solved? Is that what
That's
you're
what
asking?
I'm asking.
Yeah,
Yes.
I don't think the problem is solved, because I have gone into police stations for persons to give statements, and the persons are telling me they want to go with the police. Mr. Samuels, the police say I'm going to release me, so I just want to do anything. You're there telling the person, do not give a statement, because remember, you have a right to silence. You have a right to tell the police, I have nothing to say as a suspect. But persons have, their spirit is so broken that even with lawyers present, they may want to cooperate with the police because they were given this promise in your absence before you arrived at the station. So the videoing of these confessions is very important. The videoing, I think that one of the, it's just like the cameras that police should be wearing now. That's a big debate in Jamaica, that if you have nothing to hide, you should not want to hide behind the camera. So cameras are one of the vices that can solve that.
All right. Well, on the point of judges then, since we moved to the bench, and it's a natural segue, one thing that causes wrongful convictions as well is the people having to abandon their appeals because of the length of time waiting to be heard.
Yes.
One thing that really I'm grappling with is why the decision to write the judgments on time is left up to the judges, because in England it is a matter for which the judges can be sanctioned. And it goes back, for me, it's a question of accountability, where it seems as though we are talking about justice, but with the prosecution and with the judiciary, we are not willing to put in teeth. To fix the backlog, we will get rid of the jury. We will get rid of everything. But to say a judge must write,
that's why you have to have a part two. Getting rid of the jury. All right, so you want me to focus on the lateness, the delays now. You're talking about delays, right?
Delays.
All right, good. So your listeners should know that the Jamaica Constitution frowns upon delays. It says that a person, both in civil and criminal trials, is entitled to a fair trial within a reasonable time. Now, one of the best ways to look at delays is what we know as the Kartel case, Adidja Palmer, Sean Campbell. If you look at the retrial hearings, when the matter was sent by the Privy Council for the Jamaican Court of Appeal to determine whether there should be a retrial or none, statistics came to the Court of Appeal that there are some cases where the Court of Appeal has ordered a retrial whilst the person is still in custody, and after 10 years, no retrial has taken place. 10 years. And based on the statistics that came to the court, because they asked for it, they said, we can't trust the system. The court said, the system cannot guarantee that there won't be a breach of Mr. Kartel and Sean Campbell and the other two's constitutional right to a trial within a fair time, because the statistics has shown that when the Court of Appeal says, yes, we will allow the appeal, but it must be a retrial, there has been no less no more, sometimes 5, 6, 7 years before that retrial takes place. And as you would have heard in the Kartel matter, when they looked, some of the exhibits went missing. So there would be a retrial without some of the exhibits. You have asked an important question. What are the rules? Are there rules that judges must comply with to give their judgments? Are there rules for the Court of Appeal to give its judgment? Are there rules that prohibits a delay beyond an X period of time? What is the bench, the mark for which you must be released? Now, there's a case called Cameron where there was so much delay whilst a person was facing trial. The Cameron case was a constitutional case in which, interestingly, they found that the delay was unconstitutional, but one of the three judges, the Chief Justice, it was a three-man constitutional court, said that the relief should be an acquittal. The other two judges said that there should be conditions that if the matter is not tried within another 6-7 months, then the person could go free. So yes, the Jamaican citizen has a right to a trial within a reasonable time, and when you look at it, they have breached that right more often than they have allowed it. So delays is sometimes persons have, as you've said it, they got 3 years imprisonment, and after 2 years, they're waiting for the notes of evidence from the parish court, and the judge doesn't write the judgment. And they say, listen, let me abandon my appeal, because unless you abandon the appeal, you could be there for more than your sentence. And that's a big problem in the system. So many persons have abandoned their appeal when they could have been acquitted on appeal. They decide to throw in the towel only because their time on remand pending sentence is about to exceed the sentence itself.
All right, so one last question before we schedule the part two. Just, a personal question, because one thing that I've been saying to myself is, I was telling myself, Andrew, you need to speak up more because you are not being fair. You are dependent on Bert Samuels. I was saying this to myself because you can always depend on a handful of people to talk up about some things in Jamaica. I find your practicer very inspirational, and I want you to, this podcast is for not just lawyers, but all Jamaican.
Yeah.
And I want you to just say what it is that has inspired you to be so consistent.
You say it's a personal question. I'm going to get very personal now. Maybe you know, or maybe you don't, that I'm an anti-monarchist. I have no respect for the British monarchy. I think that and I know historically they had a monopoly in the transport of my people from Africa along the Atlantic Ocean. They control the seas and they earn money off the blood. So when it comes now to being King's Counsel or Queen's Counsel, I've never looked in that direction. For someone to call me King's Counsel, or I would never apply for it as a personal thing. It's a disrespect for you to call me King's Counsel or Queen's Counsel. I have no interest in that. And the reason why it impacts on how I think is that because I'm not seeking that office, I'm prepared to speak truth to power. And the bench has power, and I'm not afraid to speak truth to the bench. Because, the bench has to sign off on whether you become King's Counsel or not. The judges have to agree with it. So I've been able to keep my independence because I'm not looking for any favors from any judge. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think I've been fearless because when I was 20 years old, a police officer grabbed me in my waist when I was at my gate. He called me, "Hey boy, come here." And I was offended. I didn't go to him, and he draped me, and I draped him back, and he pulled his gun. So I know what it is for young men, especially from poor areas, to be abused by the system. And therefore, if you ask me, where did I get this courage from? It's from my personal experience. It is because I see myself as PC, not KC or QC. I am PC. I am the People's Counsel. So some of the matters that I have done, that case I told you about, the murder case, I did it for free. I didn't get any fees. And I think I have a deep sense of justice, maybe because of also my Christian background. My father was a pastor. And I think that Jesus was very radical in his protection of the poor. And, he would not compromise. He didn't care if people wanted to stone a woman for adultery. He would stop them. And so there is a radicalism in in the Christian faith itself, that kind of gives me an excuse to go out there and be fearless. And also, I have looked at the criminal bar, the opportunity I've had to become an attorney. I don't take it lightly. I was educated by taxpayers' money. I got free education in 1974 under Michael Manley's government, and therefore I think that the people have funded my education. It's just to give back.
I really thank you for the time. Let's schedule the part 2.
Yeah, I'm ready for part 2.
Thanks for listening. That was my conversation with Bert Samuels. Remember, to see the article that we discussed in full, go to my website, andrewwiles.com/stuck. There you'll find show notes to the rest of the episodes and more information. Until next week. Hey, thanks for listening. Stuck is written and presented by me, Andrew Wiles. It is brought to you by The Wave on the Frequency Network. Subscribe to Stuck wherever you get your podcasts. You can read more about the project at andrewwiles.com. And if you found the conversation interesting or helpful, share it. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.